our topic today is engineering privacy at scale. So how can companies navigate that shift from being very compliance focused earlier on to what we're now seeing as a more strategic approach focused on business outcomes? And so with that, I thought I would start off with a question to Beth. And that question is, so as you mentioned with Ford Direct, you work in that very dynamic and privacy sensitive space of marketing and advertising. So can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you've seen over the past few years and how they've evolved?
Sure, thanks Elaine, and good to see you too, Jules. And Chris, good to be here with you to talk about this great topic. There's no shortages of challenges, right? So this is very interesting for all of us working in this area because it means it's never boring. I think that there are so many challenges that we face in this area that I will just focus on, some of the current things that we talk about because they can be opportunities too. And I was very excited when I first met Wirewheel and talked to other privacy tech providers because it means we are reaching a different phase of the evolution of this topic that will help us get to a more strategic place. And I was very encouraged to see the poll and how many people represent companies that are in those more mature phases of evolution. That's another good sign that we're making progress as an industry. Some of our challenges, I'm just looking, I scribbled some notes earlier. One of them, which is not unique to our industry, but impacts our industry a lot, of course, is the cookieless challenge. The discontinuance of the third-party cookies, which is something that we've all relied on to track and measure and understand and use to personalize is something that I think many of us are deeply, deeply challenged with right now to come up with the solutions on how to manage that. It means we're going to implement and figure out how to implement new ways to do the things that we used to do using those cookies. Another one is how do we get do we have an affordable way to maintain a current understanding of all of our data assets in the data lifecycle, from acquisition to enrichment, insights, intelligence, use, sharing, disposition. There are some very expensive ways to do that some companies are positioned to do readily, but based on conversations I've had with a lot of people in this industry across different sizes of companies, maintaining that inventory and that understanding of that very basic question of where is your data, how's it being used, how's it being shared, the onward transfers, the different ways to ingest the new data. It's a challenge for a lot of people. And then the other piece that is definitely a challenge. I'm not even going to mention the legal challenge because that, of course, is everyone's challenge. That's table stakes here. But then the consent piece, making sure that we all have the defensible rights to use the data that we have in the ways that we want to and need to, and customers want us to generally. So that evolution of managing consent is another challenge that I think many of us are faced with every day.
Yeah, and that echoes a lot of what we hear when we are out in the market as well, talking to prospects and customers. So over the years, how have you seen technology possibly help you in this area? Or if you haven't, if you could wave a magic wand and define what sort of technology could exist to help you, what would that start to look like?
You want me to answer that too?
You or anyone else?
I'll go briefly and let Chris and Jules weigh in on their magic wands, or Chris and whatever you view as the customer's magic wand. But taking all the things that we do manually, including reporting and metrics, and helping us to manage it in a way that we could we could elevate it to a more strategic level instead of just compliance-based reporting out on, things that have to be done based on a statute or a regulation. Automating manual processes, of course, is baseline, and a lot of technologies do that now. That's kind of was the first or the beginning stages of privacy technology. How do you automate those things that can be automated? Having that common reporting understanding so that companies can report to their boards, report to their executive management teams. So I have a lot of things that I would want the technology to do. So it's just a question of prioritizing what are the most important, for your business.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll add this, and let me suggest that you take any thing I suggest with a grain of salt, and I'll tell you why. When some of the folks who started the first companies in this area came to me a number of years ago, I said, there's no business here because everything is so nuanced and everything is so legally gray, and every question you ask me about what you legally have to do here or not, I can tell you, well, here's this regulatory opinion, but that's not quite clear. And so how can you put this into a tool when it's really nuanced, sophisticated legal and policy advice? So clearly I was wrong because, you guys and others have built these businesses, and clearly companies have found that they need these tools in order to function. So don't listen to anything I say, but listen to this though. What we did, since none of us are great business people on my side of the table, we're law and policy and think tank people, is we actually asked the folks who hopefully do know. So we spent a chunk of time talking to the senior chief privacy officers of several dozen companies, and then just about every leading company providing privacy technology, to start to understand where we all need this market to go and how has it been evolving. And as you saw, I think from the survey you did, there's different levels of maturity. So when I say how it's been evolving, there are people who are maybe still in phase one where they just need a tool to do X, and rather than build it because they don't have the resources or the time, or it's already been built, so let me go ahead and and scale a tool. But what we saw was really the development of a privacy stack, moving from I need a tool to do X to I need a platform that helps me with the complexity of risk management, which means a whole bunch of things related to data that nobody else is doing, and that my team has a say in driving or pressing or insisting. But we were starting to see also, I think, what I call a third stack. And again, this was among perhaps, sort of a bigger, more mature set of companies. But even there was a lot of differentiation. We saw an increasing number of companies saying, if I'm going to be relevant as the senior privacy executive, I can't simply be the person dealing with risk minutia. If I'm actually if my business is a data business, which every business seems to say it is, and if my business is deeply focused on better managing our data, having more utility from our data, learning more from our data, serving our customers, however, that company thinks about it, and I'm looking to be aligned in the senior executive suite as not just a kind of legal burden that you got to pay for and hopefully they, keep us from doing bad things, but rather we need data available to us to be used in the ways we want to use it. And the senior privacy executives increasingly were trying to see themselves, some more successfully than others, depending on how the companies have the roles set up, as people who are supporting a business outcome of supporting customization, supporting research, supporting a certain data ecosystem, supporting analytics, and being the enabler of access to that data by having all the tools that they needed to ensure the availability, to ensure the consents, to ensure risk was handled right. And not everybody was doing that successfully. The buyers of some of the technology, as I think, Wirewheel knows, very often are increasingly CISOs and other people playing information governance roles. And there is some risk that many of us who come from sort of privacy land could be left behind as just sort of giving some legal advice and, influencing and, having some say, while the critical issue of can we use our data where we need it in the ways we want it, becomes a core responsibility of others, with us being trusted advisors. So in a report that we released, which folks can grab at our site, you can sort of see the results from the interviews that we did. But I'll say just one more thing before I let you jump to the next question. We just finished and haven't yet published a second report where we asked many of our folks who just wanted to talk to each other, right, about privacy metrics. Everybody in the space isn't clear exactly how to measure themselves, right? They do annual reviews, and what are they counting? The number of data breaches? Oh, is that really their fault? Are they accountable that there were X number of data breaches? They're counting a number of subject requests that they've handled, response time, right? A whole bunch of KPIs, none of them really feeling like they are truly measuring how well your department is doing, or maybe more important to senior management, how well is the company, positioned? And so it was interesting to see more of them saying, what does my work look like when it comes to the ESG report? Or what does my work look like when it comes to supporting the business outcomes that the company wants? And it was interesting. We did these completely separately. They had nothing to do with each other. It was interesting to see how that was starting to align in what the more sophisticated privacy tech products were seeking, and what the vendors and what the companies who said to us, here's where I see these products going, with sort of the alignment of where the more sophisticated folks were going on how they want to measure themselves and how they want to be drivers of business outcomes.
If I could just jump in one thing, that's where I see the linkage in what Beth said and what you said, Jules, is that my magic wand would be, one of them would be kind of more coalescing around what are the KPIs that are driving these things. Because as we automate processes, if we can get them more standard, then we know that we're helping to drive business outcomes, because the KPIs in privacy are aligned with the KPIs in the business, and having that kind of more industry coalescing on how do you measure the success of a privacy team, right? And how can you transfer that to the business I think would be a really powerful step.
Yeah, and that's the challenge for the privacy tech industry, because Jules and I have been talking about this for a decade, right? How can the technology take and quantify those things that we have to do and that are the compliance-based metrics, and also elevate it for things that make it so that you're really good at privacy, so that it shows up in your ESG score, so it shows up in your ethics program and your brand promise. Who do you want to be as a company to, relative to privacy, which is part and parcel of your reputation. And that's the, that we talked a little bit in the call previously about, the language and using the same metrics and the same language and the same taxonomy, and how do you do that? But I'm optimistic, because what we're seeing now is things are trending in that direction. Years ago, security did this, right? Security didn't have all the tools that they had 20 years ago, but there were inflection points and, investments and companies that made it a priority, and it worked, right? Security tools are bound to do all of these things so that security is measured in a relatively consistent way. And I'm optimistic that privacy can do that too. And whether it coalesces into ESG or some other way, I think it's going to happen.
I think that's an interesting point. And so Jules, question for you. You did this research, which is a great paper. I encourage folks to look at it. When you talked to others about that shift from that compliance focus to more business driving outcomes, were there any prompts or indicators that an organization would be ready to make that shift? Or like how did companies kind of fall into this acknowledgement or recognition that there was this third layer of the stack and that there was this need out there.
Yeah, I think the mature, one of the challenges for all of us is that the maturity levels around the world, companies, big, small, people who, you've got these huge companies that think, well, I just sell cereal boxes, so I'm not a data company, right? But then you're like, but you're a huge advertiser and you use a lot of data. No, not really. We manufacture stuff, right? So you have, very large companies that are, not at a highly sophisticated level of how they have incorporated this. You've got, companies obviously that are at the spear's edge of every regulator's, attention and who, have put a fortune of resources in. So I think one of the challenges for companies is, the tools are really very different depending on who you're selling to, right? Some people just want to put up a cookie banner and they'd like it to be legal and they don't understand why they're being criticized when they're doing what everyone else looks like they're doing, but yet it's not the latest guidance of this regulator and that regulator. And so they sort of want you to be their legal advisor because they're buying kind of a tool. When I do my taxes, if I'm not running the most sophisticated business and I use, my tax filing software, I kind of expect not to go to jail if I fill out, what my deductions are. And obviously, if I'm a sophisticated player and I'm got all kinds of hedge fund stuff, there's obviously, I probably ought not to be using, a simple program because of the complexity of what I'm doing. And so on one hand, you have even very sophisticated companies who simply, I don't really care about ads and all that. Just give me a cookie banner, that I need. And then you've got others who really want the nuance of, being able to customize and reflect, each country's regulators' view and what Max Schrems think the rules ought to be, whether or not the law matches that. But that's what, the advocate view is in that regard. So we did see, at the senior levels, folks perhaps being a little bit worried that if we don't seize the moment that the world is having this digital acceleration, and at the same time, this incredible regulatory complication. Many of you may have seen today, Microsoft announcing that they're going to hire 20% more people in their legal and regulatory, and they already have, thousands of people. And somebody then took a look and, counted up how many public policy or legal jobs, were available at some other, tech companies, all in this general compliance bucket. And it was, hundreds and hundreds. And so, we're at this time where people are coming in, regulators are coming in. It can really occupy all your time doing everything to mind the P's and Q's to simply stay in compliance with regulation. But the senior folks were recognizing that, if you're senior management and if you are part of the strategic, leadership of the company, you need to, embrace, just like the CSO is at the table with a certain set of, strategic ideas that help shape some of the thinking of how products get rolled out and so on and so forth. And I fear many of you also probably saw the IAPP research that said that, salaries are going up, but you're seeing a shift where women are being paid less than men. And what's interesting as, somebody who started out in this area 20 years ago, this was initially an area where the most senior leaders were female. The leaders at, many of the prominent companies who were drawing certainly the biggest salaries, were female. And I wonder whether what we're seeing as sort of, more energy and more battle and more litigation and more funding and more strategy, are we seeing, some of this bias of, of the salary flip being reflected because of these trends as well? I don't know, but I think it's a key time. And I think the tools are key allies so that the teams here can both mind their P's and Q's, but also have the metrics and the KPIs that they need to really demonstrate how well they're doing. But again, how at the end of the day does my tool support a business outcome instead of simply being something that helps me do a data privacy impact assessment.
Yeah, the one thing, it sounds, oftentimes, I think we're transitioning from the point where it's where privacy is just thought of as a compliance cost, as opposed to really what we're all looking for is how does it become a revenue enabler for companies? How do you give the business team the freedom to say, because we've done X, Y, and Z, this is a, go for this. This is a great revenue opportunity for you that's low risk.
Here's a problem that we found as well, right? And part of this isn't necessarily solved by privacy technology companies, right? Beth talked about the gray and, the lack of, you also mentioned sort of the lack of clear standards so that, if everybody agreed on what the law said, then obviously easier to have tools that plug in. And look, that's going to take time, and that's the nature of the messy regulation and so forth. But what we heard from people critically, though, both on the privacy tech company side and on the buyer side, was I don't think we see a good enough taxonomy about the services and the offerings as well. I need data mapping. Everyone says they have data mapping, and it turns out they all actually mean something else by it. And it wasn't easy for me to actually understand which companies did what and what it meant to do that. This company does something around de-identification. Wait a second, does that mean you just have a spreadsheet that walks me through the right steps, remove all, unique identifiers, remove all indirect identifiers? Or is it a sophisticated platform that actually, handles some of the statistical and algorithmic noise and gives me, the metrics that indicate how well I've de-identified? So there is a challenge for the sector itself, the companies providing these technologies, to come together and establish a bit more conformity about what are the services that support the business outcomes, so that they can be matched up a little bit more easily for the buyers. And then people obviously can compete with the right features and ease of use and all that sort of thing. But when you're not sure what you're buying because it's just called something else because companies have developed in different ways, I think it's slowing some of the progress that we think can exist.
And I'll just add and layer on one thing that may be an oversimplification, but the magic wand from a company perspective would create the platform, right? So Jules talked about the platform, and platform is a word that, being in our business has been, everybody has a platform. I would laugh at it, right? You got a platform for this, you got a platform for that. But the privacy platform, having a la carte set of menu items on the platform that you can pick and choose. Nobody wants to have to go to this company for this piece, and this company for this piece, and this company for this piece, and this company for that piece. Having this place where companies can choose based on their size, based on their profile, based on their risk profile, based on their budget, based on what their belief is in privacy and how that ties into the strategic priorities of the company, would represent sort of next level. I know some companies are doing it. I know some companies are working on it. I know it's on a lot of roadmaps, but being able to do that and do that well would be of great assistance to anybody faced with these challenges.
Yeah, and look, it's going to be necessary because it's the same data very often, right? Like it or not, global privacy control browser settings are here, right? It's in Colorado law. It's indirectly in California. European advocates are proposing it, and we'll probably see it at the federal level because it's now out there. And right now the state of the art is, well, you have some cookie banner that responds to it, but these are triggering do not sell requirements. And if you've got your cookies or other unique identifiers linked to data you sell, right, you are being told to opt out of the sale, and not everybody's got that data linked today in a way that's easy to do. Now, maybe arguably you'll argue in the US I don't need to, but the European proposal is intended to trigger, a legitimate interest right to object, right? So all of a sudden we've got, my do not sell tool, and we've got my cookie tool, and we've got, my data mapping. So like it or not, it's, I think what we started seeing, and those of you who know the market, right, have seen either acquisitions where companies are, rolling up adjacent companies, or creating interoperability and partnerships where things, or even marketplaces where these things fit together. And if successful, it's a huge opportunity because there obviously are adjacent areas like, I don't know, ethics and compliance and, some of the other, if data is underlying so much of what we do, data ends up underlying a lot of the other risk areas as well. And so I think people who really have a big vision for this, market really see it playing a much bigger role than where it is today, as sort of a collection of, of 6, 7, 8, 10 different services, and more. I don't know, I guess a decade ago, you had, IBM and others trying to create the chief marketing officer's dashboard, right, of all the different things. And so they could really understand and see the company's, marketing ROI and tools across. And the question is, who will this belong to when that happens, right? Will it be the privacy land people? Will it be some other sort of data and information governance sort of people? I think how this platform develops and how it ends up supporting kind of the people from where we come from, privacy land, who may need to grow and frankly, pull in some of those adjacent skills and have some of those people perhaps reporting to them. I think we've seen some people become chief data officers in our world. It's a limited few, but a couple, Joanne Stonia at MasterCard, a couple of others. But I think that's what we're seeing at the leading edge.
So I want to touch on something you said a little bit earlier, which ties into this. So, the Microsoft announcement about expanding their staff. On the one hand, it sounds like there's a ton of job security for folks like you, all right, and for Beth. But on the other hand, it sounds like there's a greater need or demand for kind of understanding how privacy interconnects with these value drivers for the business, revenue generators, as Chris called it. How, any tips or any thoughts on like how privacy professionals can start to bridge over into these areas that are so critically important that speak of the third stack? How can they work more effectively than today with these teams so they can build up that competency area?
Beth's a GC, so her answer here I think may be interesting. I'll tell you my answer, which is I try to encourage our staff to go to fewer privacy conferences and more business and technology and data related events, or in terms of their reading, right? We can follow all that stuff, but you could spend all day like reading and following. There's just an unknown amount of stuff coming out every day from the EDPB, from the FTC, from this guidance, from that guidance, this critic, right? And you could be chasing that nonstop. And obviously, we got to keep up. But, the people at the senior executive suite deeply understand the business and the data flows. And I think the senior privacy people who have a unique awareness of what can or can't be done and where the trends are about where data is going or not, from a legal point of view, from the techlash point of view, you sometimes are the only ones who actually know where all the personal information is and what it actually looks like and what permissions you have to use it, because it isn't anyone else's job to know exactly that. And so when you're actually also a fairly savvy, and not all of us are, a lot of us are just like, we're lawyers, we're compliance, and, we're scared of tech. We don't use it. We're very privacy focused. And I get it, right? That's why we're in this space. But when I talk to some folks, and all of you, probably talk to a regulator who's like, well, I won't touch that. I'm like, you're in charge of telling me whether, these smart speakers are legal or not, and you don't actually have an expert understanding of like what it does and what it should do. And they're like, well, no, it's privacy risk. So a lot of us are truly privacy people, and we're not super enthusiastic. But my argument is, as someone who's a bit optimistic about this stuff, that you got to really know and enjoy and care about the way your sector uses information so that you can actually give strategic advice. Anyway, as a GC, Beth, who's got therefore a bigger role, does this resonate?
100%, Jules. and it's the right advice. We've been actually saying the same thing for, my whole career, basically. Get out into the business, stop talking to other lawyers. It's even just for legal, just regular lawyers. Don't just sit and talk amongst yourselves. Go out into the business. Our job is to support and enable the business to achieve their goals. We are a strategic business unit that helps the business, be successful. And we've done it informally, for as long as I can remember, by making sure we do understand, our business happens to be technology. So we have to have a baseline understanding of what technology does. I've been a tech geek since I learned how to code a little bit in the 90s. So watch out. And I think that companies are getting more sophisticated in the way they operationalize privacy throughout their business. A lot of companies have, we call them privacy champions at ForDirect. We've had them informally, and now we're formalizing it to really take people from every single different area of the business, both operational roles and support roles, and giving them extra training, extra understanding, having them, be the designee for different initiatives that we're running at the company, to really give that ownership to the whole business, because it's not just a legal thing. It's not just an IT thing. It's a business thing. And I think, we're really fortunate at ForDirect that we have a good understanding of it, especially, the younger generation, I think, just gets it intuitively in a lot of ways. Our board, we spent a lot of time talking to them about how it powers our use of the data, and how there is a translation from good practices and privacy and security and all these areas, and the ability to leverage that data to achieve the business outcomes. So I think there's some good ways that companies are doing now and have done. What I'm suggesting is nothing new. Companies have been doing it for a long time, and the big companies have been doing it as well. And you just can't give up. You have to continue to have those strategic conversations, because a lot of people don't get it. A lot of people, that may not understand those nuances and that translation. They view it as a compliance-based topic. You have to spend time to educate them and say, no, this isn't about, avoiding the penalties of CCPA. This is about how our business can move forward. And it's a challenge that goes along with, I think, the job.
Now, I'll concede this may not be completely simpatico with the notion of the independent DPO, right? And to the extent that, the European model is that there is this somewhat removed figure who, is not all about how the business is going to optimize its data to do X and do Y, but rather, is the independent voice, quasi, I think there's a sweet spot there, perhaps, where you can, bridge that. You're the voice of the consumer. That obviously does, line in to where the business strategy, can and should be. But look, I think for the global strategic future, it may be that, the senior folks doing this are not the DPO model, or that the US model long-term is not the DPO model.
Yeah, and I would go back to Beth, that comment you made about the analogy with security, right? Security kind of leveled up when it became pervasive in the organization, and people realized it wasn't the job of the guy in security or the woman in security to fix this. It was everybody's job to focus on security. I think there's if we're talking about how do we scale, I think the cultural aspect is really important.
For sure. So there's that cultural aspect. Something we touched on as well is language. So when we speak to different groups, Beth, when you speak to different groups, something we discussed earlier last week was this idea that, there's just a mismatch in the terminology, the words being used, the understanding of what a privacy professional might say compared to what is actually being asked for from a technical or an engineering side, or just that shared understanding. So Chris, I have a question for you. As someone who has talk to lots of customers and prospects on both sides of the house. Where do you see the gaps and the mismatches in terms of language or anything else between like privacy teams, engineering teams, or other teams?
Well, one was 100% it's the language. And I'll do this because I talk with software engineers all the time, and I used to be one or reformed one. You ask any software engineer about privacy and they will explain that they know what PII is, and that's all it is, and it's not anything else, and I don't care what the regulations say, it's this, right? So there is that education standpoint of making sure that they understand the language, and a lot of times it is they use the same words but they mean different things, and that's a huge disconnect for a lot of companies as far as that goes, which is I think frankly a challenge. And the other one is just there's a consistent communication gap between there's an abstraction layer in how we talk about data that's somewhere between broad categories of data and records in a table. And it's that there's oftentimes that's where the arguments end up happening, which is like, because in general, privacy doesn't edict rules based upon fields and databases. They say this type of data needs to be treated this way, right? You need consent for this type of data, and that is normally, kind of has some kind of relationship to this detailed data, and that there's a lot of noise in that. And I think that's a challenge I think that everybody has right now is another magic wand, right? If you could quickly go into a company and help them understand for that company, what's the right level of abstraction to think about data for their use cases so that you can speed decisions, but still at the right level of focus.
Greg Erickson makes an interesting point about Adobe, looking at customer experience for KPIs. And let me be a little provocative because why not? So obviously, right, if you've got the ability to measure that, you can use that to push back against something a business is doing. We said we are committed to a good customer experience. That's a bad experience. If regulators are looking to do something and you say, actually, that's going to be a bad, experience. But I feel like if all the risk or human rights or regulatory issues, were sensitive to the customer experience, the business people would do the right thing, because you could clearly see that people don't like it and we shouldn't do it because it's going to, in the long term, right? Don't think short term, think long term, and we'd win some of our arguments. I think, unfortunately, privacy is a little bit more complex than the customer experience. And you can do stuff that is good for the customer experience, but that is actually bad for business, or maybe bad for regulation. Let me give you an example. There's a lot of research that shows that people don't like, the experts want, but people actually don't like these chronological timelines. There was just a little flap. People thought Twitter was changing, that you didn't have that option, right? The reason we get algorithmic results is because the actual experts who study this stuff say, this is what you want. You will consume more and like my product and be on it all day and get what you want, because we are providing the results from your friends that we think you want to see, or the tweets you think you want to see. And there's a lot of research that shows when you let people flip it to what they think, no, I want to see all, their engagement drops because they're not drawn back. Now, maybe that's better for our lives, right? But the actual experience, which if you judge it by, I like the result you gave me, right? That could end up radicalizing me, give me more and more wacko stuff, right? But the experience, right? I like the customer experience when I finish one movie and it rolls me into the next. Oh, look at that. That's their. It's actually not in sync with what society thinks is the right thing, and not where regulators think. So look, we've messed up the customer experience with a lot of our regulatory stuff, right? Our European regulators think that you should stop and think before you have a cookie set. And it has been, terribly impactful to the customer experience. But the view of those who say, stop, think, this is a serious decision, right? This is, you're donating your data to science here. You're giving it away to a commercial entity. I want friction, right? I think it's is it Ryan Kahlo or Woody Hartsock says, privacy is about creating friction for users so they don't do what is easy or maybe even a good experience because they shouldn't. It's like a speed bump. I hate speed bumps, right? Who likes speed bumps? But I get that they're there because, hey, go slow here. This could be a risky block. So I don't want to be too provocative. Obviously, customer experience.
So Jules, I went full circle as you were speaking. At first, I wanted to challenge you. Then I agreed with you. And now I'm back to wanting to challenge you again. So that was a really provocative answer. And
I should have stopped while I was ahead.
A great question by Craig, because that is something that, yes, that speed bump analogy is perfect. You know, as somebody that we're part of the car ecosystem, question always comes up, why do you make the car go, 150 or 120 when the speed limit is 70 or 75 or 80? But I think Adobe's right and everybody's right to consider the customer experience, and we all do. We have to. And I was going to say, these are all consumer privacy laws. Who are we doing this for, if not the consumers, if not people, if not all of us? So isn't there, I think you kind of just proved the point that we're still, I don't know if we're in stage 3 of privacy technology evolution or if it's a 10-point scale or whatever it is, but it's still clear we're early days. Because if we have to rely on a cookie consent banner and me sitting down and going, should I accept this or not, knowing full well that the service won't work unless I click the button, we're not there yet. So I think we do have to think about the customer experience. Maybe that will change. Maybe the research is different depending on your jurisdiction, where you are, your age group, your anything, all that market research. But how do we not think about it? Any of us who've worked for any company ever have talked about the size of buttons and the placement of your terms on the real estate. And even Chris Soladz from Navigate, who's a consultant we've used for years, who's helped us with our privacy program, tells a great story from Marriott, where back in the earlier days, they did A/B testing for their online reservation system. And they would have a banner that said, "We care about your privacy and security at Marriott." And the other one didn't. And their take rate on the one that just had that simple one-line statement that says, "We care about your privacy and your security," meant that they had more online reservations, which of course was interesting to management because that translated to dollars, and was interesting to the privacy and the security people because it demonstrated that there was some value to that. So I think you cannot ignore the customer experience, and that always, it's top of mind for a lot of us, right? It should be. So how do we weave that into, doing the right thing while still satisfying regulators and our legal requirements?
How do we bridge from the fact that obviously it's a customer and consumer experience at the end of the day that drives the revenue and that is the relationship, that regulators around the world know this is a human rights issue, and so there are more important things than you making the money or your customer being happy. There are broader things that we want considered. And I think maybe in the US, the way it's going to converge is the notion that for ESG, it's not just about the customer or your revenue, it's about your employees and the environment and broader consequences and the market force, right? And so maybe I'll charge you more because I want the driver to have a living wage in the delivery service. So it's not the best thing for the customer, but it ensures a well-paid, workforce. Or maybe I will force you to do some stuff that is inconvenient, but it helps me recycle, or I don't use a certain material. It's not a great customer experience to use one of those pathetic straws or those forks, that are, biodegradable, but like it's right for the societal role. And one critique that we're seeing aimed at privacy tech, a very smart, very effective professor named Ari Waldman has been arguing that the privacy industrial complex, whether it's the tech used or the privacy professionals, that it's performative, right? Which I guess sort of means making it look like it's all about privacy when, the real merits the philosophy, and of course we can't have like a judge and a philosopher and a lawyer sitting like at the elbow of every person. So, maybe it's a bit of a naive sort of view, but I think we do have to hear the critique that the goal is that we bring this sort of humanity and societal obligation into it. That's not at odds with customer experience, but maybe it means defining the customer as stakeholder experience, right?
We are at time. I'm looking at Angie and Stephen. Do we have time for one more question, or are we on a tight schedule here? You're on mute, Angie.
Sorry about that. Stephen, do you know if we can take one more? He's not answering, so I would say yes. Go ahead and take one more question.
Okay. We did get a question from the audience. I'm going to abstract that out a little bit and kind of continue on a thread that we've got going around the role of experience, customer experience, and privacy tech. So, I got this question from one of the audience members around WireWheel's capabilities, and I'm happy to talk to Kevin Brown afterwards about WireWheel specifically. But a question that came up when we were preparing for this panel was, what is the role of privacy software? And is it up to tools such as WireWheels to determine what meets standards and how companies should manage data? So I'm going to throw that out there to the group, get some closing thoughts around that, and then we'll wrap up the session.
I'll start. I've always thought of prior to WireWheel, I had a company that focused on data processing in the legal space, large scale data analysis. And one of the key things we realized is that that generation, we got to the maturity in that space because we were focused on, our job was not to be lawyers, not to have expert lawyers, not to try and do legal opinions, but try and make sure that we gave the lawyers who made the decisions the right set of tools and made sure that they had transparency into what was happening. And that's largely how the legal industry has been shaped kind of going forward in large scale litigation. And in my mind, I think that's the vision for what a privacy platform, as you said, Beth, like it should be doing. It should be empowering you with the right level of visibility and control to make the decisions, because you all are the privacy experts for your businesses.
I agree with that, Chris. I think we're looking for enabling tools. I don't think privacy tools can be the regulators in absentia. They're not going to say yes or no. Jules is looking at like, no, I don't agree with that. But I know that
he's going to go in a circle. He'll come back.
There's going to be guardrails, and you have to have a lot of smart people coding the things properly. So again, using his analogy, we don't expect to go to jail if you don't pay our taxes using the software. But I don't see it as a substitute for doing the work that we need to do to help configure the technology to help us do our work.
Yeah, obviously you're not the CPO, the DPO, the legal, and your product can't know exactly what's actually going on so that you make the decisions for people. And a lot of sophisticated companies are going to make that decision themselves. A lot of non-sophisticated folks, or sophisticated but not about that particular feature or issue, need a little bit of steering so they see. Right. Let's just take the cookie banner example, right? Like there's a lot of cookie banners that are getting a lot of heat. And some of them, maybe senior people said, I'm going to take the risk. But a lot of others maybe took the default or had a lot of options and just chose one without being sort of guided that this would be the more conservative. Or so I feel like there's a demand somewhere, somehow, to make it easy for me to use the product right, or maybe even a conservative way, and then let me make the decision that because of whatever reasons, I want to be a little more risky and liberal, but I think there's a bit of a steering that needs to happen because there is a vast audience of folks who just want to do it right. And it should, it ought to be easier to do it right out of the box without forcing people who may not be in a position to make smart decisions. And I get that there's a risk. There are complaints being filed against, the IAB Europe and IAB Tech Lab for putting rules in place for how ed tech should work as the standards body. And then they're being sued as the controller, right? Or for influencing people to, violate GDPR, or at least according to the critic. And they're kind of like, we don't even touch the data. We're just providing a standard, and they're being dragged into it, right? And I don't think we want the vendors being dragged in to, to this. But I get that sophisticated folks don't want it happening. And you guys, like, how can you be telling people what to do? So I don't have the answer, but I feel there's got to be a sweet
I'm
spot here.
picturing a lot of "Are you sure?" buttons if they do it wrong.
Again, it may not even be wrong, but it like maybe walk me, right? This would be concern. I don't know. I don't have the answer, which is why I'm sitting here telling you what to do instead of figuring it out. But and look, maybe you got companies that are buying like, third-party advice and buying, making it easy to incorporate, guidance so that it's, one click away. And maybe that's the answer, right? Walk them to the answers they need, because they just don't happen to have a lawyer, but they need actually legal advice to click the button, right? The engineer is doing the setup without the lawyer sometimes because they've got to do the setup. So who's going to help the engineer do it right in the cases where she doesn't have a lawyer at her elbow?
Lots to think about. I see Angie with her cane to drag us off stage. I want to thank this crew for a lively discussion. And Angie, any other kind of last words for this panel or audience? You are on mute, I think.
I am on mute again. Thank you, Jules, Beth, Chris, Elong. Great session. Please join us for the next session coming up here in just a few minutes. So we'll drop. Thanks, everybody.